Hold on, Pat. I can say a few words first. Well, welcome. There's a person who was going to come from Medina, Ohio, and asked, and then childcare things came up, and so they asked if we could maybe record it, and I thought I might as well give it a try. So, welcome to this second attempt at developing an International Thomas Merton Society chapter in Erie, Pennsylvania. I want to thank Mary Margosian and Pat O'Connell and, of course, Mike Brennan, who came from Chicago, and his wife Margaret is here, and we're so glad to have you. So back in Denver at the Merton Conference, I talked to Mike, and he's the coordinator of all the chapters, and there's chapters all over. Can you hear? Oh, okay. Can everybody hear? All right. So
move away in the back, can they?
So there's all over the world there are chapters. There's a lot in the United States, and so Mike will be sharing with us after the talk. Okay, so it's going to go talk, and then question and answers, and then more about Thomas Merton and the International Thomas Merton Society. And you all have a packet, and Pat will direct you to your packet at the proper time. So I want to start by introducing Dr. O'Connell. And when we were meeting back in April or whatever about this day, Dr. O'Connell said he didn't want to do one thing we asked him to do, but he would do this because it's very relevant. And so I want to start with a quote from Pope Francis at the end of the Synod of Bishops and Laity in 2024. He said this, and I love what he said. In this time of wars, we must be witnesses of peace, and also learn to shape in concrete ways the conviviality of differences. The conviviality of differences. Differences give life to community. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a Catholic monk who cared more about the conviviality of differences than Thomas Merton. And you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who understands his conversations, his writings, his life, and his work, somebody besides Dr. O'Connell. Dr. O'Connell brought me into this world of Merton. He's mentored me as a scholar, a writer, and let me just share with you some things that he's accomplished. Dr. O'Connell is Professor Emeritus of English and Theology at Gannon University and is internationally recognized as one of the preeminent Thomas Merton scholars. He is heavily involved in the International Thomas Merton Society. He was a founding member. He has major works in Merton studies. He co-authored the award-winning Thomas Merton Encyclopedia. He's developed the Monastic Wisdom series. He has edited 16 volumes of Merton's materials, including 12 volumes of his monastic conferences, such as Liturgical Feasts and Seasons. And he most recently authored Thomas Merton's Holistic Spirituality. And if you want to know how good that book is, just ask Father Coos. He'll tell you. So thank you, Pat. It's your turn now. And use your outdoor voice. And we'll look forward to asking you lots of questions when you're done.
Thank you, Aaron. The thing that I didn't want to do that he was talking about was a 45-minute ad for the book that I wrote recently. So this is sort of the alternative there. So thank you very much for coming. And there are a couple handouts in the packet that you would have gotten. One is an outline of the talk, which is, I forget which color that is, but it's not there because you can't follow what I'm going to be saying otherwise. I hope that isn't what the reason is. But if you're not a big fan of taking notes, which I'm not, this would sort of save you the trouble. And the other thing it would be good for is if you're trying to figure out how much longer is this going to go on, if you kind of trace it down on the outline. Maybe discouraging to find out how long it's still to go on. But anyway, and the other thing is actually that booklet has the text of the letter that I'm going to be talking about. And there are actually two different versions, and one version is in bold and the other version is in regular, and it's got footnotes which you can safely ignore. But anyway, it's something to peruse at your leisure. It's not something I don't think. And I should say, what else can I be doing besides listening and looking through it? But anyway, that's available there if you want to read it later on. So the material is actually something that I put together last year to coincide with the anniversary of the completion of the Second Vatican Council, and in particular, the promulgation of one of its most important documents, Gaudium et Spes, which is the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, which is what Merton is really considering or going to be talking about in the material that we're going to be looking at. Right? But then when I was thinking of what I could do for a presentation like this, it occurred to me that it might make a suitable topic for a talk that would be apropos for our semi-quincentennial as well. I don't know if any of you have said semi-quincentennial out loud, but it's a lot of fun to say, so we won't have a group recitation of quints and whatever it is there. But in any case, and at least I feel as though any sources of fun we can get over the next couple of weeks are worthwhile, since there's going to be some rather grim things going on as well. So if things seem to get tough, just say semi-quincentennial and everything would brighten up. Okay. So some of you, I'm sure anyway, are probably aware that Thomas Merton was a powerful voice for peace and justice in the final decade of his life, from around 1958 to 1968. And he saw this as an essential element of authentic Christian discipleship. Right? And in the early 60s, he's writing articles against war and oppression, especially in Catholic magazines like Commonweal and the Catholic Worker. And in 1961, he wrote a prose poem on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima entitled Original Child Bomb, with the subtitle, Points for Meditation to be Scratched on the Walls of a Cave. Gives you kind of a perspective on how he thought the whole thing is going to turn out. And then the following year, he put together a collection of essays, including one of his own, entitled Breakthrough to Peace, 12 Views on the Threat of Thermonuclear Extermination. And he was really the editor of the volume, but prudentially he decided not to be listed as editor. And we find out by the other book that he wrote or put together in that same year, which was called Peace in the Post-Christian Era. He had it all ready to go, and the Cistercian abbot general said, nope, can't publish it. Monks shouldn't be writing about these sort of political issues. And so it finally got published in 2008 or sometime around there. So he's basically forbidden to write about issues of war at that particular time. The ban didn't last all that long, just a couple years, because, of course, Pope John the 23rd comes along and writes Pacem in Terris the following year, 1963. And Merton actually wrote to the Abbot General said, the Pope wouldn't have been able to publish this either if he was the person. How about it? And the Abbot General said, no, I think we'll let the Pope, but not the monk. That Abbot General died. And the next one was a little more flexible. Although at first he says, you can write about peace. You can't write about war, but you can write about peace. How you split those two up is a little difficult. But in the end of 1964, his book, Seeds of Destruction, came out, which actually had a lot of the material that was in the banned book in a little different format. It included a substantial discussion of Pacem in Terris as well, and pretty quickly that idea of only peace, not war, kind of faded away. So that takes us up to mid 1965, which is when we want to stop and take a closer look. So two things are happening in the summer of 1965, or about to happen in the summer of 1965. One is that by the end of the summer, he's going to have retired from his position as Master of Novices at the Abbey of Gethsemane and become a full-time hermit, living in the hermitage that had been built 5 years earlier. And the last 3 years of his life basically going to be spending as a rather unique form of hermit life. And the other thing, which I already mentioned, is that the fourth and last session of the Second Vatican Council is taking place, and the most important document that's being discussed at that fourth session is this pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world that was called Schema 13. It ends up that there are 16 documents in Second Vatican Council, and I guess this was the 13th in line. But anyway, everything up until this particular time, they would refer to Schema 13. There was even a magazine for a while called Schema 13 that was being published during the time of the council. So that's the situation. It's June 3rd, 1965, and Merton writes in his journal, Dan Berrigan was here Monday with Jim Douglas and Bob McDowell. We talked a bit about Schema 13 and the alterations that have been made in the article on war. It really seems they want to approve the bomb after all. So Merton was alarmed by the fact that the various reports that he had been hearing, unofficial reports, as we'll see in a minute, various speculations currently circulating, evidently seemed to be pointing out that there was going to be a kind of hole big enough to drive a tank through, or maybe fire a missile through, in the document as far as the licitness of nuclear war. So he finishes up writing in his journal entry. He says, "We must do what we can to prevent a disgrace and scandal of such magnitude." And then his efforts to do what he could would occupy him repeatedly over the coming weeks, and include actually a previously unknown version of this particular letter that he's writing to the American bishops that we're going to be talking about. So what's the first thing that he decides to do? He's going to write to a particular bishop, right? So on June 7th, so 4 days later after this journal entry, he decides to write to the Archbishop of Baltimore, Lawrence Sheehan, right, who had just been named a cardinal by Pope Paul VI, and his when he dies, the New York Times obituary calls him the leader of the liberal wing of the Catholic hierarchy of the United States. A very strong advocate for civil rights, very strong ecumenical aspect of things. As far as issues of war and peace, kind of an unknown quantity, at least at this point. I don't know if anybody remembers Cardinal Sheehan. In his own time, he was pretty bad. I remember him quite vividly because before he became Archbishop of Baltimore, he was the first bishop of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And his diocese extended, the eastern border of it was the Housatonic River in Connecticut. I grew up on the other side of the river. We weren't in the diocese, but Bishop Sheehan's name was mentioned very often. But I was a little kid, and it took me a while before I realized that Bishop Sheehan in Bridgeport was not Bishop Sheen on television. So but his name anyway was out there. So he decides to write to him because he thinks he'll have a sympathetic ear, right? So he begins actually with a lot of the times when he writes to sort of high church officials, he has this kind of formal style that he does. So I sincere hope that I am all that I'm about to say comes from the heart of a loyal and concerned priest who, in a spirit of filial trust, addresses himself to an admired and respected shepherd on a question of momentous importance for the whole church. So he kind of starts off that way. He writes to popes too, and you get that same kind of maybe a little even flowery language there. But in any case, he goes on and gets to his point. He says, from what I've heard, the revisions to this draft about modern warfare would seem to contradict the clear principles laid down by Pope John and Proxima Terrace, and indeed the consistent teaching of all the modern popes. Right? So he says, if that's the case, and there's a departure from official church teaching, if there's any sort of ambiguity, if there's any sort of equivocating, it's going to undermine a clear witness the church has been providing up until now. And he says it's a scandal. It would be a scandal as absurd as it would be avoidable. Right? So he goes on and says what the council needs to do is not to go along with this cynical attitude that, yes, peace is wonderful, but you need hard-headed realpolitik in order to get along in the world. And he says, ideally speaking, the chapter of war on Schema 13 should go beyond Pope John and Pope Paul's statements, and if not, at least it shouldn't fall short of them. So he sends this off. Before he sends it off, he said, what we need is some American bishops. He's worried about the American bishops because there seem to be a group of them that very much are sort of involved in a realistic morality as far as nuclear war is concerned, as far as war in general is concerned. So he says, what we need is a member of the American hierarchy to speak out at the council and make it clear that those who are asking for a more quote-unquote realistic morality do not speak for the American hierarchy as a whole, and get as many other bishops as you can to go along with this, right? To serve the voices of reason and sanity, countering justifications rooted in a narrow, far from Christian nationalism, reliance on an overwhelming military force in preference to the rule of law. And of course, the Vietnam War is going on at the moment, and all the bishops know this, and so they're going to kind of be reading the American view of things through this lens of this undeclared war. Well, he gets a letter back from Cardinal Sheehan. Cardinal Sheehan was on vacation, actually, so he had to wait for a while. So it's not till June 18th that he gets this letter back. And we've heard this sort of thing time and time again. It's this sort of, very conciliatory, anodyne, non-committal. But thank you for your thoughtful letter. I'll certainly take it into account. Thank you for your candid expression of your prayerful thought. I haven't really had a chance to study this. In fact, he says it hasn't arrived yet, and then he writes a little handwritten note at the bottom. Oh, it just came. So I guess it just came, but he hasn't looked at it yet. So, he says I'll be mindful of your observations as I study it, and that's it. Right? That's the last he hears from the cardinal. Right? So what's he going to do next? He decides that, and this is July 2nd. All right, so another week after he hears from the cardinal. I've decided to write an open letter to the American bishops about Schema 13 in the chapter underway. So he's not going to keep trying individual bishops. He's going to kind of put it out there, and it's going to be a public letter. So he wants it not only to get to the hierarchy, but for other people to be able to read it. So before we look at this kind of second stage of the process, though, we have to stop and ask ourselves, is he being alarmist? Because as a matter of fact, and as he's going to find out fairly soon, the sort of pessimistic reading or the pessimistic reports that have been coming out about the way in which the new draft has been organized proved to be not really true. All right. He writes later on, what we had feared did not take place. The Constitution was quite clear against the bomb. So the reports that his friends who had visited him, Dan Berrigan and these other two peace activists, they didn't have the official word either. Not accurate. But on the other hand, it wasn't completely unfounded. That speeches by some bishops, not just American, but especially American, at the third session of the council were very much against any kind of condemnation of total war. Right? The most militaristic of these American bishops was Bishop Philip Hannon, who at the time was the auxiliary bishop in Washington, D.C., and had actually written for the Washington diocesan newspaper anonymously, but everybody knew who it was that wrote, attacking some of Merton's writings on war. So they had a history, although Merton wasn't really adverting to that in particular. But at the council, Bishop Hannon gets up, and he's a former Army chaplain, so he has this military background himself, and he calls for a complete rewriting of the section. So he wanted this third draft to be different than the others were. He claims that the draft that they're working with had ignored the traditional teaching of the church on a just war, which wasn't the case. That they assume all nuclear weapons were automatically incalculable in their effects. They fail to recognize the plight of nations now suffering under unjust aggression, and the tyranny of materialistic atheists. Need to recognize and praise those who defend freedom, especially those who died for it. I mean, all this rhetoric, which would be quite familiar in a certain kind of group of the American church. So even though Merton's assumptions that the actual text of the draft was saying these sort of things, which it wasn't, he was right in saying that there was a strong voice, even if it was a minority voice, that was making precisely the kinds of objections that Merton was afraid were going on. Okay, so it isn't just being kind of plucked out of thin air. It's actually things that were being said. And when they come back for the fourth session, by this time, Bishop Hannon has become Archbishop Hannon. He's now the Archbishop of Baltimore. Wait for the Archbishop of Baltimore in a second. Archbishop of New Orleans, and he's even stronger because they didn't change it. No matter how persuasive he thought his remarks were at session 3, the draft that comes out of it and that they're looking at in session 4 doesn't have what he wants it to. So what does he do? He submits these 3 modi. These modis were, a modus was a response to the text. He claims that the document outlaws legitimate defense, which it doesn't. Right? He claims that atomic weapons are being singled out as the cause of war rather than hunger and injustice, which it doesn't. Both of those things were mentioned in the text. And his third modus is to say, if the aula, if the assembled council members, the bishops, don't vote to throw it out, to throw this part of the whole thing out, then they should vote to throw the entire scheme out and get rid of Schema 13 altogether and don't have any pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. So this is his response, rather ill-tempered response to what he finds out when he gets back there. Force Pope Paul to withdraw it entirely. Right? And he manages to get 10 bishops to sign on to these modi, all right, to sort of, like the amicus curiae thing you have with Supreme Court justices and so on and so forth. Right? So Archbishop O'Boyle of Washington, who was his boss, sort of out of loyalty signs on. Cardinal Spellman of New York, who is I don't want to say a great warmonger, but somebody who is definitely on the more militaristic wing, signs on. And a third person of the 10 is Cardinal Sheehan of Baltimore. Right? But Cardinal Sheehan, practically the next day, he takes his name off the list. He withdraws his name from the letter after reflecting on the matter. Right? So we may hope that reflecting on the matter was going back and reading Merton's letter and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, I don't want to be taking this particular position." So we at least might wonder if we're recollecting what Merton had said and saying, "Oh, I think I got that letter," and digs it out. And in any case, he pulls himself out. So the ultimate upshot of this whole thing is going to be that the language of the third draft on the legitimacy of using nuclear weapons or even possessing nuclear weapons is going to be kept. Although there's going to be other parts that maybe weren't. But anyway, it's going to get passed. But it has more negative votes. I mean, it's only about maybe 10 or 15%, but more negative votes on that really than any other segment, not only of this document, but of any of the documents in the 4 years they've been meeting. So there is an undertone of not being completely supportive. Okay. But that's down the line, perhaps, a bit, and Merton can't foresee what's going to happen. So anyway, he sits down and then he writes a quick rough draft of his letter. And you can tell by looking at the rough draft, which is still in the archives at Bellarmine, where Merton's materials are kept, that he's actually composing it on the typewriter. There's all kinds of changes that he makes right online. Merton incidentally is and evidently never learned to type, touch type. strictly a two-finger typist. And one friend of his comes in and sees him. He's writing a letter that I think he's going to send off with a friend. And the friend says, he's like a demented woodpecker. Actually, two woodpeckers, I guess, going a mile a minute. And that he says Merton is able to write to type with his two index fingers faster than any of us could type with all 10 digits there. So his own way of going at it, right? But in this first draft, he says, if this is such an important issue that one may believe that the whole work of the Vatican Council stands or falls with it. And he emphasizes that getting into all these technical questions and the theoretical possibility of having a nuclear bomb that would still conform to the rules of the theoretical rules of the just war and so on and so forth is really to miss the point. The place that you have to start is with the gospel of love and hope that's not bound to any particular time and culture, and that this has, this message has special relevance for an era when people have in their hands incalculable power for destruction. And that for the document to somehow reflect a belief in the primacy of power and violence and terroristic threat of mutual destruction as permanent features of our civilization is really to betray the message that you find in the gospel itself. And even if you say we're only allowing for controlled use of nuclear weapons, that still amounts to what gets called, and he goes into the details called city trading, which is really, he says, a brutally, cynically calculated targeting of defenseless, innocent non-combatants precisely because they are defenseless and non-combatant. And he says, speaking to my particular audience, all right, you, the American hierarchy, will be sitting in the council as citizens of a nation which is at war in Asia, a war that could potentially escalate to global proportions and mass destructions, right? So echoing what he actually had said to Cardinal Sheehan, now saying it to everybody. He says, if the council elects to give official approval to nuclear weapons and by implication to total war, the effect will be a scandal of such proportions that it will neutralize the great pastoral good that has been so far accomplished. And he says any hint of such justification would undoubtedly be exploited by every militarist and political opportunist to cloak its own unprincipled use of force. So everybody that wants to use these weapons is going to come up with some kind of rationale for doing it and saying, this is therefore acceptable. Right? So he kind of winds up this earliest version of his talk by saying the task of the council is to affirm the church's message of love and salvation in terms which are most relevant to the modern world, right? And consequently a narrow focus on fine moral distinctions rather than the forthright proclamation of the Lord's own message expressed in the opening words of Mark's gospel. The time is at hand. The kingdom of God is here. Repent, believe in the good news. He says it would undermine the commandment of love and constitute a most serious temptation and grave danger for the church in the modern world. And then he ends up by saying, it hardly seems that it would be sufficient for the council, speaking as the church in the modern world, to make a practical option in favor of power over love and disinfect the air with an exhortation to military men to be sure they make acts of love when they are destroying cities. So, as I sort of read that, I think, this it must have been very subjectively satisfying for him to kind of end up this way. Whether it would be very persuasive to his primary audience is another question. And it's one of the details that he's going to consider, I think, when he's doing the next version that's actually going to be sent out there. So he's got that. 5 days later, July 7th, off he goes with a new version, which he sends to Commonweal magazine, sends to a lot of his friends. He sends one to Dorothy Day, sends one to the Swiss theologian Hans von Balthasar, who is a correspondent who really loves Merton's poetry in particular, and a number of other people. And but is trying to get it into a magazine, and trying to get it into a magazine as soon as possible, because the time is getting short. So he develops the kind of three further developments of the whole thing. Right? He does have some kind of minor alteration. Instead of saying nuclear, a lot of times he'll say modern warfare, modern weapons, and so on and so forth, rather than, or atomic, sometimes he had been using. So to kind of make it more general and not get too much into specific types of weapons and so on and so forth. Right? And same thing with war. He talks about modern war rather than nuclear war and so on and so forth. So these little changes, which is typical of the way in which he writes. Virtually every article that he writes, he'll write a first version and then kind of go back and check it over and so on and so forth. And then the second thing that happens, he changes the beginning and the ending of the whole thing. Right? So he began in his draft with just a whole background. You're on your way to Rome. You're going to be dealing with all these issues of church in the modern world. God bless you, and so on and so forth. So that all kind of goes, because by this time they're already in Rome, or they will be by the time this comes out. And so he gets right into the nub of the matter. He said, "You've listened with patience to so many opinions. You will surely bear charitably with this expression of deep concern, written not in order to defend a merely partisan view. This isn't a political thing, but to ensure that the great work done by the previous sessions is not damaged by a failure to meet one of the most crucial problems of our time." And then when he gets to the end, he replaces that sort of sarcastic conclusion about military leaders making interior acts of love while destroying cities. He replaces it with a less sort of confrontational reference to the church itself. He says, which might hastily add that even though power is in effect more efficacious, one must try to prefer love, at least in the abstract. And then he adds another paragraph saying, "It's up to the Council Fathers to bear witness clearly, without any confusion, to the Church's belief in the power of love to save and transform not only individuals but society." And then he ends up, "Do we really believe that love has this power? If we believe it," and he can't escape from a little bit of irony, "if we believe it, what point is there in splitting hairs about the superior morality of killing 1,000 defenseless non-combatants rather than 1,000,000? And, is quantity what's really important?" And then he does insert then three significant additional passages. Right away in the second paragraph, he says something about the gospel message isn't bound to any particular time and culture, and he rejects the idea that refusing to identify the church with a medieval or Baroque Christendom. If you're not going to be like the Middle Ages, the only alternative is to identify with this technological society in its present confusion. He says the authentic Christian position is what he is later going to call transcultural. The Christian is called, as always, to a decision for Christ, not to a decision of this or that kind of society. He's called to obey the gospel of love for all people, not simply to devote himself to the interests of a nation, a party, a class, or a culture. And then, so strengthening that aspect of things. And then he adds another new paragraph saying that inadequate guidance on the issue is going to harm particularly vulnerable segments of the population, one who don't have all that much education, one with limited resources, material and spiritual, one's easily deceived and manipulated by propaganda or intimidation. The common person, the poor person, the man who has no hope but in God, he says, everywhere looks to the church as a last hope of protection against the unprincipled machinations of militarists and power politicians. Would it not be a dreadful thing if the council were to say something, even by implication, to destroy the hope of the defenseless and thrust them further into despair? And then he goes on to say, above all, the church cannot evade her duty to speak out in defense of the innocent and uninvolved non-combatants who in ever greater numbers necessarily become the victims of massive terroristic use of force in modern war. The indiscriminate slaughter of all, combatant and non-combatant, must be condemned. So what we find then in this version of the letter is Merton's own passionate commitment to gospel nonviolence, but also this, providing arguments for the council to reject the legitimacy of any justification of nuclear weapons that he hopes will be persuasive across the spectrum, that it will not only bishops that would already agree with it, but bishops that might be convinced by the arguments that he's presenting, or even general readers of the text who are going to encounter it elsewhere, kind of seeing how the present situation, the signs of the times, fit or don't fit with the public, with the gospel. So that's that version. And it takes him a while to get it published. Commonweal, for some reason, doesn't want it. His friend Ed Rice, who publishes Jubilee, he doesn't want it. So he finally manages to get it published in a magazine that's called Worldview, which is the monthly publication of a New York-based organization called the Council on Religion and International Affairs, which isn't very well known. And although it's edited by this James Finn, who used to work for Commonweal, so he has a little in with them. So it comes out then in this September issue of Worldview, and comes out a couple other places too. This kind of Catholic Worker sort of place up in Canada publishes it in their little newspaper. Actually, that may have come out even before the Worldview version of it, but it's unlikely Merton even knew that the newspaper existed up at this Catholic Worker House, and that they were going to publish it. But anyway, it's out there. But as well as sending it to magazines, he sends it to a couple of bishops. One of them is the Bishop of Pittsburgh, John Wright, who eventually is going to become a cardinal and part of the Curia, and becomes very, very sardonically critical of various kinds of experimentation with liturgy and so on and so forth. I kind of debated back and forth whether I should say this in public, but I was at a talk that he gave at Holy Cross when I was in school there, and he was celebrating one of the teachers who was retiring, and he said, I walked by this chapel there, and I could hear the priest saying, "This, except for the raisins, is my body," which sounded to me like very blasphemous and obviously untrue. But he pulled out all the stops with his objections to things. But at this time, anyway, he's very much he's somebody that Merton had corresponded with, and who seems to be on the same page as Merton as far as the War and Peace issue is concerned. But even more important is the Bishop of Alberta, I think it's Alberta, Winnipeg, in Manitoba, Bishop George Flaliff, who was a Canadian Basilian priest who eventually became a cardinal also, and somebody that he knew was saw things pretty much the same way as he did. And Archbishop Flahiff writes back to him and says, I looked at the draft, and it's not as bad as you think it is. Well, what he says is that it does not ignore the point you make. Even protest and resistance are provided for to some extent. Some parts of the text are forthright and strong, others marked by distinctions that can be considered pussyfooting, falling back on restatement of traditional positions, such as the permission or obligation to follow the decision of public authority in case of doubt. But then he goes on, he says, why don't you write me up some responses to this, and why don't you look at the text itself? As you know, it's confidential, but we're encouraged to consult with a trusted few to whom we may communicate the text. I'd be happy to have your views on it. So he includes a Xerox photocopy of the relevant section, and he says, if you care to formulate a comment or criticism on the section as a whole, some particular point on it, which is usually more assistance, I'd be glad to use it as an intervention or basis for an intervention at the next session, right? And that would exemplify the way in which bishops should be consulting the faithful, as far as it sounds like kind of an early version of synodality, although not actually sitting in the same room, but consulting the charisms of other members of the church in the deliberation. So Merton does this. He writes up three things. He sees the real problem then with the document as it exists is not whether they're kind of giving permission to use the weapons, but what happens to the people who conscientiously object? That conscientious objection really becomes the heart of the problem. Right? So he makes three specific suggestions. First, that in case of doubt, it sounds like the document is saying you have to go along with the duly constituted authority, with the political authority. So Merton questions that. And then he says, allowing for conscientious objection, it sounds like you're just kind of allowing for people who have tender consciences, scruples, and so on and so forth as something exceptional, rather than seeing that if this is immoral, that everybody should be objecting to it, that conscientious objection shouldn't be sort of an outlying position, but should be a position that would be taken and should have been a position that people would be taking during the Second World War, and this kind of follow the advice of the political authorities obviously didn't work there, but even on the Allied side with saturation bombing and so on and so forth. Right? And then the third thing he talks about is that in the American situation, where they don't allow for selective conscientious objection, with objection for particular wars, you have to object to all, or no CO for you. So anyway, he sends these to Archbishop Flahiff, and Flahiff, who was famous for only once in the entire 4 years of the Vatican Council did he actually speak out orally on the council floor. And he doesn't this time either, but he does write up something and send it in. As far as I know, we don't have any knowledge of what's in that text, but it seems very likely that what he's done is pass on Merton's suggestions to the people as a whole. Right? So that brings us then to the kind of the last situation, which, what does Merton do then? Merton, once he finds out that what he's focused on largely in the draft that gets published, or in the letter that gets published, isn't really the nub of the problem, he rewrites his letter. Right? He has another version. How do we know this? We know it because he sends a copy to his friend Jim Forrest, who is a great peace advocate right up until he dies in 2022. And how do we know this? Because after Jim Forrest dies, we the Merton Society published a memorial issue for him. And one of the things that we published in it, it's in there someplace. If anybody wants it, it's an extra copy. I'll put it out somewhere. But one of the things that we published in it was a talk Jim Forrest had given at Notre Dame in 2017 called "Saying No to Caesar." Right, and in it he has a couple of quotes from the open letter, and as I always do, because I'm rather scrupulous, I always look up any quotations on Merton that appears in the magazine, which I edit, because everybody makes mistakes. Right? And some people don't realize they have to quote exactly. So I'm always changing a little bit, at least one or two quotations from various articles and so on and so on. Well, I went and looked up, found he had two fairly lengthy excerpts from the open letter, and I looked at the published open letter, which is in the 5th volume of Merton's published letters, and neither of them was in there. I said, what's going on? So there's this mystery going on here. In fact, I originally was going to call this something like, manifesto and mystery. And manifesto was everything I said before, and then the mystery. What's happening here? Well, I kind of go back and I find a little note that Jim Forrest writes to Merton saying, could you send me one or two copies of the open letter? And Merton evidently did, but the copy he sent wasn't the usual mimeographed copy and published copy and so on and so forth that everybody else had. He had, in the meanwhile, taken one of these mimeographs, crossed out almost half of the material that was in there, and wrote in another half of it, new stuff. Right? And there's no version of that. On the cover of it, he writes, "Brother Dunstan, please use 3 carbons." So there would be 4 copies of this thing. And none of them exist in the archives there. But what does exist is the actual version that he crossed out on and rewrote on, and so on and so forth. So that's what you've got in your packet. You've got actually the final version. The new stuff is in bold. The old stuff is in regular type. So you can see that he's really changing things. Even in the last stage of things, when it's only going to 4 people. I suspect 2 of the people were probably Bishop Wright and Archbishop Flahev, but I don't know that for sure. So what has he done? He's emphasizing then this whole sense of individual conscience, but also the fact that the church as a whole should be a kind of sign of contradiction to this easy acceptance of going along with what political authority should say. He says, it is imperative, this is new stuff, it is imperative to stress the obligation of conscientious protest against a fruitless, immoral use of force, and to encourage the crucially necessary exploration of new nonviolent methods of conflict resolution. He even goes so far as to say, much more explicitly than in the previous version, this is the real heart of the problem of modern war. That once you get people, once you have the authorities declaring war or not declaring war, but just waging war, then everybody supposedly should go along with it. We heard that actually from a bishop recently with regard to the war in Iran. He says, the individual Christian conscience must be liberated from a forced automatic submission to policies based on requiring complicity with an immoral use of force, and adds that this must be must result not in adopting the stance of a passive bystander, but studying about and participating in new methods of nonviolent resistance to use them in a truly Christian way. And then he concludes the whole thing, a third conclusion that he's got here, even milder, murdering 1,000 rather than 1,000,000 combatants he does away with. So he concludes it now. He says that the lack of faith and of faithful discipleship would be the cause and consequent result of using language of adroit compromise in order to leave the last word in matters which affect the very survival of human beings, not to the gospel, but to power politics. A subversion, betrayal of the church's mission of witness in word and action in and to the modern world. So, that's the new stuff that comes along. Now, we could argue that this final version really doesn't matter at all, okay? It's just kind of reappeared. It was never published. It wasn't even distributed privately in mimeograph form. And it was never noticed from that day until this. Presumably it had no impact on the eventual text of this chapter 5 that the war stuff was in. And we don't know that it had any effect on the American bishop's opinions of modern war or conscientious objection or anything like that. And so it's of limited significance, other than providing sort of further evidence of Merton's remarkable work ethic and perhaps a few additional insights into his own developing approach to modern war, questions of nonviolence, and so on and so forth. So, but on the other hand, if you look at your outline, we're to the bottom of the page. On the other hand, 6 decades later, we find ourselves in a time when, at least from my perspective, a narcissistic, vindictive chief executive continually slanders and demeans political opponents and minority residents, rules by arbitrary whim and extortionate financial threats and policies, when he illegally and unconstitutionally attacks other countries, providing only the most specious of rationales and making not even a pretense of seeking congressional authorization, a time when refugees and immigrants are demonized and imprisoned and deported without even the appearance of due process, a time when American citizens, legally and peacefully responding to brutal tactics of government agents, are callously attacked, arrested, even murdered, a time when trillions of dollars allocated to the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, at home and abroad, are defunded to fund massive tax reductions for the wealthiest members of the American social, political, and financial elites, when substantial members of the American church, authorities, and self-appointed Catholic lay leaders have sometimes provided explicit or implicit support for some of these anti-Christian policies. So that there is then, in fact, a certain timeliness in Merton's prophetic call for creative, conscientious resistance to immoral government decrees and demands. In concert, of course, with the recently elected Pope, whose very first words to the city and to the world emphasized his commitment to the gospel of peace, and whose dual North and South American citizenship would have won the admiration and perhaps the envy of the monk who articulated so eloquently and passionately in poetry and prose a vision of a spiritually, culturally united hemisphere. Paul said of himself he wanted to be a person of the whole hemisphere. So Merton's exhortations in both versions of his letter, I would suggest in conclusion, to the American bishops and to the American church as a whole, remain open to both perennial and new insights and interpretations, to the perennial and new invitation to live the gospel commitment to personal transformation and to make the reign of God visible and tangible in the circumstances of our place and of our time. That's it. that sounded like more clapping than the number of Thank you. So, any comments, questions, observations, etc.? Jim?
I've been ran garden spreads a while, but please tell me the truth. So does the document garden spreads have absolute condemnation of the use of nuclear war and the possession of it, or what is the teaching on it?
Well, it has absolute. One of the things that gets said over and over again is that the only absolute statement that's made in the entire group of 16 documents is against the use of weapons of total destruction. The idea of deterrence, as it's been left up until almost the present, is one where there is a little wiggle room there, but it's always being seen as something that is in process of moving toward total disarmament of these weapons.
So there's an absolute condemnation of the use of any nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
But can you? But you can possess them on the way to disarmament.
That's the way it's expressed. Yeah, and that when the U.S. bishops write their document on the challenge of peace, which Cardinal Bernardine is sort of
remember the year on that?
That's 85. It might be. I don't have it written down. But
somewhere in there.
Yeah, somewhere in there. That is there as well. And then when John Paul II writes about it, you've got a little stronger emphasis that this isn't just rhetoric. We really need to see things moving in that direction. And when you get to Pope Francis and when you get to Pope Leo, they are saying with no modification whatsoever, possession of nuclear weapons is immoral.
Okay.
So we see over the course of these 60 years, the absolute prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons is there right from the beginning. And then you see this sense of movement as far as possession is concerned.
Which Father Merton would be happy with?
Oh, sure. Yeah. He would definitely be pleased in the direction that things are going in.
Thank you.
Good. Glad you brought that up. Allows us to kind of see that bridge as well.
Any other questions? I hope. I was struck by the way you presented. Just he was never done with. He was so persistent and creative, and he even writes about the way that the populace kind of like just there's nothing we can do. So, and that's sort of since I've been alive during the nuclear arms race and now war, citizens really feel helpless to do or say anything generally. But you said his work ethic. So could you say a little bit more about like how persistent he had to be, and like there other people, his fellow monks or all over the world, were they also actively asking these questions?
Some were not. He certainly would have been a prophetic minority about the whole thing. But I mean, part of it in this particular set of circumstances is I think he feels I didn't quite get it right the first time. I didn't quite have all the facts. And he says this when he sends this, letter out to Commonwealth. He says, I may be wrong about this because I haven't seen the actual document. And when he writes to Ed Rice, who is his friend and who has published his material on war and so on and so forth, he said, maybe you know better than I do whether this is going on. If so, let me know. But when he actually gets the material from Archbishop Flahiff, and looks at it and hears what the Archbishop has to say, that you're going to be pleased with most of this. He realizes, I think, the sense that I get is, I can't leave this just as it is. I have to respond to the actual language that's being used here, even if it means that it's not going to get publicized. Even though I'm certainly not going to get at this point somebody else publishing this new version after the old version was published. But I may be able to get it to a couple people. I'm getting it to Jim Forrest, who is going to influence him. I'm probably getting it to these bishops who are going to bring my insights. Certainly, the three things that he says in the letter to Archbishop Flahev, which he also says in some ways in the new version of things, is kind of a response to the document as it actually is. And subsequent to this, he's going to continue to write on these topics. I mean, he has that really great article on nonviolence that he sends. Actually, it's being published by Hildegard Glossmeyer in Germany. But blessed are the meek. He's reflecting on the Beatitudes. And I think it's the best thing on nonviolence that's ever been written.
Besides the Beatitudes.
Well, the Beatitudes are in there, so he incorporates them in there. But the job of the Christian is to live out the reign of God, the absolute future in the present, to bring it alive in the here and now, which is sort of where I wanted to end the talk too. In our time, in our place, that's what we have to somehow be manifestations, be sacraments of the reign of God in whatever way we can, both as individuals and as a community. So he's going to continue to. It's not as though, okay, I've written on this letter. I've written 3 times on this letter. I'm done with this. I'm going to go on and do something else.
Right.
He does do something else. He does all kinds of something else's. But this is one through line that's going to continue right to the time of his death.
Okay, will this material be in the Burton Seasonal or the Annual? I mean, are you sending it in, or are you going to put it out?
It actually is out.
It's out.
I have it in the 2025 annual because I wanted it to correspond to the 60th anniversary thing. So even though it's 2025, it's just the 2025 annual is always coming out well into 2026 by the time it gets published. So it's out there. It's also going to be the one thing I had to change about it was the list of enormities of the current administration. I eliminated some of the first year of enormities and substituted second year of enormities in there. But I've got another book coming out the end of the year, which is called Revisions and Revisionings. And there are 8 chapters in it, and they're all about things where he takes something, publishes it, and then has another version, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be in there too, slightly different text, but pretty much the same thing. It's out there, or going to be out there. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Paul, thanks for your talk. I guess to follow up on the work ethic comments, I think what struck me, I'm coming from a Wesleyan perspective, and John Wesley would talk about, doing all the good that you can, and I wonder if Merton and Wesley would sit down and have a beer together.
I'm going to turn that question over to Aaron, and he will explain why. Not just because of his background, but because of his foreground.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that, Aaron?
Wesley and Merton are brought together in a book about the spiritual formation movement, which was located at Asbury Seminary started in the 50s. He met with the president of Asbury, and then subsequent scholar Mulholland took up Merton's teachings on contemplation and certainly being at peace and stuff. So there's a lot to mine there, Mr. White, and yeah.
And just a quick comment on that. The sense of just the work ethic, you drill down and how he would continue to revise with the new information you got. I think about like the Wesley quadrilateral. What is that? The
Quadrilateral.
The idea, part of it's reasoning. And to hear what you're saying about the conversations with Asbury Seminary, I think it speaks to like the spirit of Vatican II, which part of that was ecumenical, yeah?
Yeah, sure.
And I think it's particularly pertinent now that we come together in that way to share our work ethic, but also the way in which we work, the way with which our individual conscience works, the way with which we come up with thought prayerfully as a broader body of Christ. So anyhow.
Thank you. Yeah. Aaron didn't explicitly mention it, but I was hoping actually that the summer issue of the Merton Seasonal would be here in time so that we could distribute it. But Aaron has a review of the book that he was just talking about in the summer, whatever year it is, 2026 Merton Seasonal, that really does a great job showing the kind of convergence. The person who wrote the book, it was really his doctoral dissertation at a Baptist university, but he's a Methodist, the guy who wrote the book. He's got Mulholland and Merton and Wesley in the subtitle of the book to show how in this spiritual formation movement, the stream of Wesleyanism and the stream of contemplative monasticism somehow gel. It really is quite a good book. I read it before I passed it on to Aaron. And, a lot of times doctoral dissertations, not the most lively and sprightly things to read, but this guy really did a wonderful job of bringing all this stuff together and giving background and so on. And the topic was something I was just completely unfamiliar with, more or less unfamiliar with it. Richard Foster, I don't know if you know that name. He was somebody that was also very involved in this process.
Speaking of the seasonal, everybody has a packet, and in the packet, you'll find, in addition to Pat's notes, there's also a brochure from the ITMS and a brief survey, and I'm going to get pens, and then Mike Brennan from Chicago chapter brought some picture cards, and he's got pictures up here, but we wanted to give Mike a chance to talk about the International Thomas Merton Society, a place where we can be sacraments to each other, where we can be open ecumenically and differences. And so, Mike, would you share a little bit about Thomas Merton? International Thomas Merton. Thank you. And thanks, Pat.
Well, I heard both of those claps the first time. That's why I thought there were more. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't think you ever really want to follow Pat O'Connell. It's rough. but I appreciate my wife Margaret and I are grateful for the opportunity to join you today for Pat's very timely talk. It's always a privilege to hear Pat's insights and well worth making the trip from Chicago. And you're very fortunate, all of you, to have scholars of the caliber of Pat and Aaron in your midst. I'd like to thank your planning committee for inviting me and for the opportunity to say a few words about my Merton journey and the International Thomas Merton Society chapters. I remember Aaron first broaching the subject of forming an Erie Merton chapter at that conference at St. Mary's in Notre Dame, Indiana in 2023, and I'm happy to see it coming to fruition this year. I had hoped to attend your inaugural meeting in January, but some blizzards got in the way and wasn't prudent to try driving through that. I thought I'd begin with a little bit about my own experience with Thomas Merton and how I came to be the coordinator of our society's chapter. So this will be a little bit more of a personal talk than Pat's very erudite philosophical talk. 50 years ago this summer, when I was just a lad, I was living in community with the De La Salle Christian brothers who had taught at my high school and were recruiting me. They didn't succeed. During a prayer service, one of the guys read this prayer by Thomas Merton, which you have in your packet. So this is a very famous prayer. It really got my attention. It's an apt prayer for anybody, but especially for a 19-year-old. I knew nothing about Thomas Merton, but I found out that the prayer appeared in this book, Thoughts in Solitude, which I purchased. I later read Merton, a pictorial biography by Jim Forrest. I brought a copy of that here too, somewhere. There it is. Rather well worn. Jim was a co-founder of the Catholic Peace Fellowship, and I would later meet him at a Merton conference in Memphis in 2007. And in 2011, he even stayed overnight at our house after he gave a talk to our Chicago chapter. I learned that the Merton Society was founded in 1987 with Pat O'Connell among its founders, and there was a chapter in Chicago which met at the Monastery of the Holy Cross in Bridgeport, which is the neighborhood where Mayor Daley came from near Sox Park. 30 years ago, in 1996, this chapter was sponsoring a retreat at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky, where Merton lived as a monk, as you all probably know, for most of his life and where he is buried. So I signed up for the retreat, and actually there's a picture over there of a bunch of us standing on the Hermitage. I'm not in it because I took the picture, but that's the retreat that I attended. Little did I know at the time how the Chicago chapter of the ITMS would impact my life for many years to come, nor did my wife have any idea. Perhaps there is someone here today who will remember attending this early meeting of the Erie chapter and hearing Pat speak. Pat, the Dean of Merton Studies and the editor of the Merton Seasonal, and perhaps you will take over my job as coordinator of chapters. Initially, I was not very involved with our Chicago chapter. I was working full-time as a baggage handler for American Airlines. I had crazy hours and days off, so I rarely attended the Sunday afternoon meetings. Margaret and I had married in 1990, and our daughter Mary was born the next year. We both came from big families, and there was always something going on. But in 2005, I got a flyer in the mail saying that April 17th might be the last meeting of the Chicago chapter of the International Thomas Merton Society. The group had dwindled, and the coordinator had stepped down for health reasons. So there was this gathering to decide what to do and if somebody would take over as coordinator. By this time, I had accumulated a little seniority with American, and I had Sundays off, so I attended the last chapter meeting, and there were 12 people there. Nobody wanted to serve as coordinator. I had just accepted a part-time job, and I didn't see any way I could do that in addition to my regular work. At the end of the meeting, we resolved to pray for guidance and to ask Thomas Merton himself for help. In my cynicism, I thought this was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard of. I figured that was the end of the Chicago chapter. And then the miracles started. The former coordinator told me that a small local playhouse was performing a play about Merton called The Hermit in New York. She suggested I put together a field trip for the chapter, and she sent me the mailing list. And that was the beginning of the end, the mailing list. At the time, I was serving as my union's newsletter editor, so I crafted a chapter newsletter. The response to this was robust. Many people attended the play, and afterwards we went across the street to an Irish pub, Chief O'Neill's, to discuss the future of our chapter, and everybody agreed it still had a lot of life in it. And that's how I became the de facto chapter coordinator. And the part-time job I had taken didn't work out, so I remember standing in the window looking out onto the street, thinking my life is over. I can't do this. So around the same time, a friend called me up and told me she noticed a blurb in her church bulletin about that guy you're always talking about, Thomas Merton. A reading group was being formed at the Passionist Monastery 10 minutes from my house. It was led by Father Francis Cusack. Later, I learned that not only had Francis known Thomas Merton personally when Francis was living in Louisville as a newly ordained priest, but he had celebrated Mass with Merton at the Hermitage, and they drank beer together.
Of course.
So I met with Francis. I told him about our dwindling chapter, and we were able to begin meeting at his monastery. And later we met in the lower hall of an adjacent parish, which was being administered by his religious order. So this location was much easier to get to, and soon the chapter tripled in size. I was able to line up a number of fine speakers, including Judith Valente, who later became the president. She's the immediate past president of the Thomas Merton Society, and she's also the program chairperson for the next biannual Merton Conference, which will be held at Iona University in New York next summer. I was able to connect with Father Vaughn Fail, who is the site coordinator for that conference. We had Pat O'Connell speak to our chapter on 2 occasions when he was passing through the area to visit family. I discovered that Father Dan Coughlin, who had served as the first Catholic chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives and was a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago, was also a Merton enthusiast. He had even traveled to the Far East and retraced Merton's steps when Merton was there in 1968. So we were able to get him to speak to our chapter. And he also was the person who gave the opening prayer at the 2011 conference, which we sponsored at Loyola University. So within a few years, we were such a cocky bunch that we proposed hosting the biannual conference in Chicago, and we pulled it off at Loyola University, so be careful what you pray for. You might find yourselves hosting international chapter conference sooner than you think. I know that Pat and Aaron and your planning committee wanted me to say something about our chapters and how they function. We're very informal. Commitments are minimal. We ask chapter members to join the ITMS, which only costs $25 annually, not a princely sum. For that, you get 4 editions of the Merton Seasonal, which you have in your packet, complimentary. That gets mailed to you. For an additional $15, you can get the Merton Annual, which Pat referenced, and that's a copy of the annuals. Now, not everybody who attends a Merton chapter meeting is necessarily an ITMS member or necessarily wants to join. Nobody checks IDs at the door. We just encourage those who are regulars to consider supporting the society. And it's a relatively modest membership fee, but it does mean a lot to us. You can sign up online and mail in a check or PayPal, and or the application is in the brochure, which is also in your pack. Many chapters function as reading groups that meet in a church hall like this, or even in the homes of the chapter coordinator. Groups like this usually meet either monthly or quarterly. Since the pandemic, a number of chapters have gravitated to Zoom. The recently reconstituted Cleveland chapter is using the Bridges to Contemplative Living with Thomas Merton series as a guide and is led by one of the co-authors of that series, Robert Toth. And I have some copies of that booklet if you'd like to see them. I brought them along here. The Chicago chapter has had a long tradition of hosting speakers, and we've been very fortunate to be able to find some really fine speakers, including some people from within our chapter. We meet from 2 to 4 p.m. on the third Sunday of the month during the academic year. And through the years, we've been fortunate to draw on a number of Merton scholars in the area, and we've sponsored a wide range of meetings. We've shown videos, we've listened to tapes or CDs of Thomas Merton, and those are available. Again, you can listen to Merton yourself in person. These were talks he gave to the novices back in the 60s. We support ourselves through free will donations. So we put a basket at the door, and we usually collect enough to cover the cost of the donation we make to the church where we meet, as well as for refreshments. We have coffee and juices and lemonade. Sometimes members will bring in a cake or fruit. We have a hospitality chairperson who provides plastic tablecloths and bakes and helps set up and break down the meeting. And we usually offer our speakers a $100 honorarium. So we ask attendees to sign in when they come in. I brought the book and left it over there just to show you that. And all the stuff on that table over there, those are like posters and handouts that of various meetings we have in the past, just to give you an idea of some of the things that we've done. So why form a Merton chapter and why join the ITMS? The sociologist Robert Putnam, in his most famous work, Bowling Alone, argues that the United States has undergone an unprecedented collapse in civic, social, associational, and political life since the 1960s, with serious negative consequences. A 2023 documentary about his work is available on Netflix called Join or Die, and it's really a good documentary about community connections and club participation. But on a deeper level, perhaps being connected to a community, especially one that values spirituality and religious themes, can be very enriching. Many of us attend church services, but there's rarely an opportunity for discussion unless you belong to a parish organization of some kind. But what makes Merton special in our day and age is that he was a follower of Jesus while also opening his heart and mind to other faith traditions, other denominations, and other wisdom traditions. Rather than diluting or diminishing his Christian witness, these interactions strengthened and expanded it. With the guidance of your coordinators and input from members, you decide what kind of chapter you would like to have. The Indianapolis chapter, for example, begins every meeting with 20 minutes of centering prayer. In Chicago, I'll generally read an excerpt through the book Through the Year with Thomas Merton. So it's nice because I can just go to whatever day it is. In fact, I was going to read you today's as an excerpt from New Seed of Contemplation. Individuality does not necessarily assert itself on the surface of everyday life. It will not be a matter of mere appearances or opinions or tastes or ways of doing things. It is something deep in the soul. So that's how we get started in Chicago. Then we jump right into our meeting. Like this meeting, our speaker will usually give a talk for about 45 minutes, and then we take a break for refreshments, and I ring a bell to get everyone's attention because people really enjoy the conviviality, and I have to draw them back. And that's, for some people, the best part of the meeting. Donuts, coffee, talking. And then we have a time for question and discussion, and some groups are able to live stream their meetings, but we're not that advanced yet, but we're working on that. The ITMS holds a conference every 2 years, usually attended by about 200 to 250 people. Again, on this table over here are a couple of photo albums with pictures from past conferences that I brought along. The 20th general meeting is entitled Thomas Merton and the Spirit of New York, Creativity, connection, and commitment, and it will be held at Iona University, New Rochelle, New York, from June 17th to the 20th of 2027. And there is a call for presentations, papers, if you're interested in writing something for the conference. It's available there on the table. And also, a discounted rate for the conference is another benefit of your ITMS membership if you do join. So it was actually following the 2011 conference that Kathleen Degnan, who was then the president of the ITMS, invited me to serve as the coordinator of chapters. And I thought at the time, because I was working for an airline, that I'd be able to fly around and check out all these chapters. It turned out to be a little more complicated. Flying standby is how the benefit works, and you can't always get a seat. And then I forgot, when you get there, you got to stay someplace. You can't, So now that I'm retired, my wife and I are able to make a few road trips, and that's one reason we decided to come out here and to offer some encouragement for your chapter. And I hope that you'll be able to keep meeting, and publicity is important. And spreading the word's important to get people to know we're here. A lot of people have no idea that there's an International Thomas Merton Society, and frankly, a lot of people have no idea who Thomas Merton is. So it's challenging to get that information out. So in conclusion, if you want to explore more about the Merton universe online, just go to merton.org, where you'll find a wealth of information. And I hope this overview has been helpful. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
I'm going to get pens for everybody.
Just in the beginning. I
Okay.
think everyone's.
Okay. So if you wouldn't mind, if you would fill the survey out.
If you would just fill out the survey, we would really appreciate it.
And then,
Yes, yes.
And I would encourage you to look at some of the materials that Mike has.
Anyone else who can? Well, I mean,
oh, sure. Didn't pull by as a 12, never right up to the point.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the language was, but he definitely
Yes, something up to
brought it up, yeah.
Bishop Sheen did too. I mean, the classic thing with Bishop Sheen was stuff. You can't kill innocent non-combatants. That's it. I mean,
And you can't not kill innocent non-combatants if you use these kinds of weapons.
right. That's why it's just, and that's at the beginning of history of it. I'd be shocked, you'd be alarmed if they were going to change the traditional, because it's so basic. You don't kill innocent.
They would just sort of do a detour around that whole part of the question, but they didn't.
Well, I like how human nature, when you give someone good, anyways, have a good day.
Good to see you, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. You are?
I'm Michael. I am, my wife works at the diocese.
Oh.
So that was how I heard about this.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard of Thomas Merton before.
Oh, really?
And this is very fascinating.
Oh, great. I'm glad you came and found it helpful.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Things that have happened, but we just, I had extra brochures, so I did.
I got relatives. And it's just kind of funny, I'm Catholic, but my father was Frank Fury, but his cousin was Frank. I go, I'm a little confused. But it's Ukraine, it's B-R-I-K, but they spell it just coming over with B-R-E.
Are they still there now?
I only went to visit them once.
Thank you.
Oh.
You're going to be a singer?
And by the way,
Have you always been on?
You have to take that?
I will when I come back. I gotta go to Baltimore.
Oh, you're on
Drinking is the Latin.
I do. I see. For all of us over there, someone else taking it. So they're sending you to Baltimore. Is she in the grave?
They'll be on the list.
Where are you from?
I'm from Erie. I go to Our Lady of Peace.
Oh, so you're right.
oh,
Anybody else going to Baltimore?
yeah.
It's from
Shane, I went to, I don't know if we should talk, but
Is that what
that's one thing about it. See, like in 1885, the rich folk.
Great, I'm glad you were able to come, and we'll see you then before you're heading out.
I'll see you at Mass at 5:15. Do you go to 5:15 Mass? The cathedral.
No, we go to 6:30.
6:30.
Oh,
Okay.
you mean tonight?
No, the cathedral daily Mass.
No, I go to the gate usually. I start my day and then I can relax for the rest of the day. Great, thanks for stopping by and saying hello.
Like Saturday, like the only day off. On Saturday?
He had across 20 miles of Canada. There was like doing 12 months. 21 miles long. But we were shocked. It was only like the first miles. We were Martian. And we were really shocked. Being charged. Well, it comes from Texas.
Anyways, I'm welcome to take anything.
Okay.
Thanks for coming out here, Mike.
So this is the patron by the front door. People are very generous. They usually.
Oh,
Yeah, and we put this out, so that I just didn't bring all of them. Just to,
Some of them that were here are not likely to join.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's not,
I get it.
it's not 13 potential.
No, there's just.
We shall see what transpires.
Yeah,
I don't see this as
Places of lodging as I'm in between.
compared to the turnout last time.
yeah, there were a lot of sisters there.
Oh, yeah.
The Benedictine, yeah, I noticed that.
How far in advance did you advertise that meeting?
I have no idea. I had
I'll have to
nothing,
ask Aaron.
nothing to do with
So
it.
he just did that.
Yeah, I was amazed by the number of people, but I think a lot of it was word of mouth because he wasn't expecting it. But Mike was talking about coming out then. I said, not coming for the movie, but coming to the movie.
Yeah. It was winter too, and I think people do things, lectures more in the winter. Because I was thinking as I was sitting there, there's a lot going on today. Wesleyville's having a huge celebration. There's a lot going on. June 20th events downtown. There's stuff happening. And so I don't know if I would have picked June 20th. June is a hot month. Winter, I go to the Philharmonic, I go to lectures in the winter. Maybe the winter time is more conducive. People want to get out, So, well, it was interesting. And then Gary Walker gave me some brochures. He's starting this young lecture series next week. He's like, hey, if you could pass these out.
Oh, yeah.
So that's going to be up in St. Mark's.
Carl Gustav film?
Yes. Yeah. It's Young and Dreams, something like that.
So he was here then?
Gary, yeah, he was sitting right on the end right here. That last row of tan tables, he was the last one.
I don't think I ever knew what he looked like.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because he has a following of people at St. Mark's who go to, he does a lot of Richard Rohr sessions.
Yeah.
I went up there for what's it called? The Unfinished Diamond.
You sent me, is that the one that you read? Yeah. I got as far as downloaded it to my desktop.
Oh, it is.
I asked Mike here, I'm like, who's Paul? He's like, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
So you got it on your.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Thank you. Yeah.
Getting two, I thought was good.